Hello, friends, and welcome to the Testing Peer podcast. Today I'm joined by Simon
Hello.
and Russell.
Hello.
Sadly, not David today, and I'm Chris. So, today we're going to be talking about something that might cause you to rile up, and that is conflict. And thinking about conflict, I'd like to thank our sponsors. We like them. Saffron QA, who are actually wonderful sponsors. They're actually a recruitment consultancy for testers exclusively. They've been a great support to us. Hopefully you've noticed an improvement in our audio quality. That's certainly been the intention. Ben has been a really positive supporter for us, so thank you very much, Ben. If you want to know any more about Saffron QA, you'll be able to find some details in the show notes. Now, I've got an important question to ask you about conflict.
Far away. I'm all ears.
You're all ears. I can see you're eager. So, have you ever had an argument that you've forgotten about why that argument started, but carried on arguing regardless? Or maybe you've discovered that you're wrong, but carried on anyway because perhaps you're a stubborn person.
I'd be lying if I said no.
Yeah. When it comes to conflict, I am a very defensive person. So even if I'm wrong, I will try and justify my way out of it. And even if the thing's been solved and moved on, I'll still continue justifying and being defensive. It's something I'm trying to change in my character in some ways, but at the moment, it's not happening. So yes, happens most times. I end up in some kind of argument. That's the way I am. I'm very defensive, unfortunately.
I'm sadly very like Simon. Justification, defending, context, giving that sort of thing is quite common. So I would say 50-50. That might be the case. There's other times where it doesn't, but there's definitely a higher percentage. I'm stubborn in my viewpoint and hard to budge. More so with personal relationships and work conflict, things like that.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I'm a lot more defensive, more fiery in personal arguments because I'm passionately involved in sorting it out, making it right. Whereas work ones, maybe because I'm not as engaged in the reasons for the argument, that I tend to back down more.
What about you, Chris?
Well, I grew up in a very vocal household. Sometimes things got a bit physical amongst the siblings. And so as I got older, I know I was annoying. I think we can all picture Chris being annoying.
Can't imagine that.
But what happened was I would actually try and avoid conflict. And that actually stained my life for a good 10 or 15 years, probably, where, like I think I've mentioned in the past, I actually would actively avoid conflict with people and arguments with things. And even if I thought something was wrong, maybe I'd have a little murmur, a little bitch about it to a friend. But I wouldn't actively engage with those things. Or I would not bring up something that was upsetting myself because I knew that bringing it up would then upset the other person. And somehow I thought that would then mean I would end up having to apologize, even though I was the one who was upset. And I thought, what's the point? So I was quite good at sort of playing through the whole scenario in my head and thus didn't bother engaging. And that got me into relationships that weren't genuine because I wasn't being genuine. It can get you into trouble because you haven't spoken out about stuff. And it wasn't helpful. And even at work, when I thought stuff was wrong, I didn't speak up about it. And actually, I think as testers, we've got almost an obligation to speak up about things, regardless sometimes of certain consequences. Now, that wasn't a very banterful thing, but it set the scene quite nicely for us to sort of then talk about conflict. And we are doing this in the context of the workplace in software development. So we've started off things with sort of quite a negative approach to those things. And so let's carry on being negative and try and end on a high. That's probably the best way to go, right? In a circumstance in the workplace where you've had a negative conflict, how has that had an impact on you and the way you approach things today. But has there been a particular conflict that you've had that has genuinely shaped you?
I can think of a couple. The first one is actually one that I raised in the Dealing with Disappointment episode, where I talked about the developer that I used to hate raising defects to, because I knew that there would be some kind of conflict, and he was very shouty, very sweary, very intimidating. And that made me quite scared of conflict in the workplace because of having to deal with that. And I knew I wasn't alone. I knew other people had expressed the difficulty in working with this person. But what happened in me there was, rather than shying away from it like I usually do when it comes to conflict in the workplace, I took it on as my mission to make it possible to work with him, try and build that bridge with him, to make a relationship that meant he did accept me when I raised defects, and he did start to trust me that I was actually genuinely trying to help him improve his code. So I took that conflict, and that changed the way I then approached development, not just him, but completely. I almost used him as the example that if I can work with him, I can work with anybody. And I used that to transform the way that I would try and encourage developers to accept bugs, accept working with me side by side on features. The second one was the difficult time I had. Even though I made quite a lot of progress in my last role and helped transform things and move things forward, there was the difficulty in not quite aligning to the vision of the head of department, and feeling like no matter how well I worked, how much effort I put in, how visible I made, what tests we were doing, I wasn't quite fitting the mold. And that was a detriment to my performance, because I was then being told I'm being put on performance plans because I wasn't meeting the goals that were set out for me, even though I was doing a lot more than that. So that's then made me very more conscious about how I move forward and how I make sure I'm not pleasing everyone, but trying to make sure I'm fitting in where I need to fit in.
It's interesting because you've made me think. I was just trying to think back to the relationships that I've had in the past. And someone who was more senior than me, but not my boss, but who was very strong-willed, very opinionated, very vocal. And I learned from them. I learned some bad habits, not just good ones, because I would happily debate things with them. That was perfectly fine. I felt in a position where I was able to debate things with them, and it was always amenable. It's in, they were of that opinion, of the view, strong-willed and all the rest of it, but they wanted people to debate with them. They wanted that heartfelt argument to resolve the problem versus a passive conversation. And that taught me that I need to be similar in my mindset sometimes. And it taught me a bad habit, that to be strong-willed at times. Now, I don't know whether I had that habit before this or not. I'm going racking through my brain to figure that out. But that sort of conflict that they kind of had, and it was a very conflicting style. It was very competitive. And I learned some bad habits about, if you feel strongly about something, be passionate about it, be bold about it, go in strong. And it took me probably 5 or 6 years to unlearn that. I'm still passionate, that doesn't go away, but how I display that has changed. I try to walk away from things that may rile me up a bit more and avoid things to a certain degree. That sort of conflict taught me a lot negatively about myself, or I think brought me into a certain way of working because it was successful for them. They were more senior than me. This must work. They were liked. They were very well respected. And it was because of the way in which they did it. They'd obviously had a lot more experience than I did. So when I did similar things, I was not as nuanced as they were. We learn about ourselves from these sort of events. Go on, Chris. What's your take?
So I was thinking about this more than just now, because I've sort of gone through various different ways of coping with conflict in the workplace. Initially, it was just keep my head down and sort of in the back of my mind think, I don't like that person anymore. There's still people in my head that I think I don't like because there's been various conflicts in those times.
You really enjoyed working with me, didn't you?
It's hard to say that we really worked together, Simon.
How long did you last together?
It was four and a half months. And he wasn't in the one day I was in the office. It was rude. So that's not the instance. But then there's kind of various different things where I kind of had to move on from just my gut reaction being like, I don't like you, I don't want to work with you, and therefore I'm going to avoid you, to trying to find a way to talk to those people. And what I've learned most in the workplace, the best way I deal with those things is when I'm riled, and it can be if someone's being obstructive, or if they're being accusational, or if they're just being negative or unhelpful. At that point, when someone is coming at me, if you like, even if it's not directly at me, it's something that I've brought up or something that I support. My instinct is that I need to not talk immediately because my heart rate's elevated. I get hot. I get upset about things. So I'm going to suppress that at that exact moment because I don't want to lose control of my response, because I could say something that maybe I do mean, but I shouldn't do because it's not professional. I haven't collected my thoughts because I'm just sitting there so frustrated that whoever it is doesn't see the world the way that I see it, or that they're approaching something very differently to me. Maybe it's personal, maybe it isn't. I think over the years, I've gone from doing nothing to then talking to somebody about it, making sure that I take a walk or I do something mentally to deal with it. Maybe it's like listening to some angry, shouty music, or I just close my eyes for a few minutes, or maybe I go on to a rant channel on a Slack and talk to somebody. Before I went to the Eurostar conference in 2019, I tried to deal with a particular thing of conflict at work by being quite passive aggressive in an email, because it placated me for that period of time. Just before I left, I had to say something. I couldn't have just left without saying something. And passive aggression doesn't really solve anything. Occasionally it can have a bit of humor, occasionally it can be this, that, and the other, but it doesn't really solve things. And a lot of people don't see the subtlety in it. Certainly didn't help the situation. And the advice that I was given by a friend at the conference was that sometimes you just got to show that you are angry. This was a Sana Vissa, who's done a lot of talks on stoicism and things like that, and talked about difficult situations and how you deal with those things. And she's not saying lose control. It's controlling that, to let people know that what they're doing isn't the right thing, and that maybe it is disrespectful, or maybe it's not the right way of doing those things. And it's okay to let people know that you're not okay with the decisions that they have done or the way they've approached things. And so in the situation I had at work after that conversation, because then I went back a week later, was I just went and I spoke to the person and we talked quite openly about it. Maybe I was still a bit frustrated. I needed that time. I needed to collect my thoughts. I needed to talk to other trusted people because I didn't want to flare up the situation. But the ways that I dealt with it beforehand never led to the situation improving. So those things could have come back. And I think we can agree that sometimes areas of conflict, if you don't deal with them, will become recurring issues.
If people can't see something upsets you, how would you expect them to learn and feedback and to adapt approaches and so on? If something annoys you and you don't get feedback, there's nothing to stop that pattern continuing. I have a problem where I feel I seldom like to back down, and it's not a good habit. It definitely isn't. And I've learned over time to do as you sort of say, to step away. I've never said much I've regretted. And in that sense, I've always been quite logical as a thinker, even when upset or angry. Doesn't mean my tone doesn't change, however. I am a kind of advocate of showing how you feel. If you can't show it, then I don't expect people to understand I'm frustrated, understand I'm upset, understand that offended me. But I've had to learn the opposite to a degree, which is not go over the top with our reaction, to kind of give a little bit, not accept everything, not to jump on every offensive thing that someone might say or shout at me or call out or say. That's really, really winds me up. And I've worked with people that knew the buttons to press. And I learned very quickly not to let them press my buttons. Learn the people that you need to show it annoys you to, and learn the people where it's not worth it. They're doing it for the reaction. They're not doing it for any other reason. Working out those sort of patterns of behaviors is quite useful. It helps you understand people and how to work with them. But some people are, and I've definitely worked with these, and I haven't met many in my life, but they get almost joy out of riling somebody up. It makes a meeting interesting or something like that out of it.
I went with someone that their actual sort of way of finding out your character was to, the first time they got the opportunity, put you in a situation that would put you on your back foot. They would put you in sort of like an alarming situation, try and get you to commit to stuff that you couldn't do, and then pull you up on it publicly because they wanted to judge your character. And that was legitimately how they would henceforth judge you. If you failed that bit there, they would have no respect for you. They wouldn't like you. They might actually be the nicest person in the world outside of that meeting, but they wanted to test you. That was kind of their thing. And the first time I was in a meeting, they wanted me to commit to giving feedback on a 30-page document that I received 2 minutes before the meeting. They said, "Will you have it for tomorrow?" And I said, "I don't know. I haven't read it." And they said, "But you'll have it for tomorrow." I was like, "No, I don't know. I haven't read it." And it was just a bit of a loop for a while until somebody, thankfully, came and said, "I've had a look. We can get together and talk about it. We'll have something tomorrow."
That's a good way of dealing with them in general, though, isn't it? It's finding the compromise versus the black and white answers to silly things.
I think the thing that I've been guilty of in the past, and it's something that the therapy that I've been doing since the last job that I left, that I've been trying to bring myself back up, was made me more aware of, is I was very much a people pleaser and also a chameleon when it comes to the workplace environment in certain places. So if the team I was moving into had a group of loud, shouty people, this is before I became a lead, if they were loud, shouty people, then that's how they talk to each other. I didn't want to be different to those. I wanted to blend in. So I would be the same as them to avoid the conflict. And it wasn't until I realized that actually that's not helping anyone. That's, if I disagree with what they're doing or how they're doing or how they're behaving or what's going on, I need to be able to have that conflict with them and resolve it. And that is when I started understanding that a bit more, that I realized that's where I can improve myself. And conflict management is something I've spent a lot of time on. I did the Crucial Conversations course a few years ago, which taught me a lot about how to have those conflicts in a diplomatic way, in a calm way, be able to talk about negatives without just putting it on their, putting it in their face straight away. This the whole compliment sandwich thing, or trying to mix things up so that they understand where you're coming from. And I think it's an important skill as a leader. As you both say, you don't jump in straight away. If there's somebody that's antagonizing you or poking you or pressing your buttons, the worst thing you can do in that moment is snap back. I very much, in those scenarios, when I had my buttons being pressed, I would shoot from the hip, and that never ended very well. So it's taking that time to take a breath, whether it's a 5-minute thing. Because if you look at, there's conflicts in the workplace every day. It doesn't have to be these big emotional conflicts that we've all talked about where it's impacted us hugely to a point where some of mine I've ended up in doing therapy to help myself get my confidence back. But there's daily conflicts over a story in the backlog or a bug or the amount of planning and points that we're going to put to a story, etc., etc. It's how we deal with those minor conflicts and bring the team together rather than turning it into a big argument that helps us move forward and improve ourselves.
Yeah. As leaders, we have to try and resolve some of these things and be the example for others to look to. You've got to kind of think about what sort of leader you want to be. Do you want to be the bull in the china shop sort of leader who charges in, bayonet sort of sharpened and so on, just to try and lead the way? Or do you want to be kind of the more diplomat? Do you want to be the politician? Do you want to be the kind of finding the peace treaty and that sort of stuff? Got to think about, what do you admire?
I think there's a balance there, isn't there? I mean, I would never encourage the bull in the china shop, but equally I've never encouraged the other end either. It's getting away from that experience of the finger pointing. the blaming when things go wrong, and etc. etc. But it's also making sure that you've got the right level of metaphorical arms around the shoulders and people that need encouragement, and helping them, support them through conflicts, rather than you're on your own, go and deal with it.
It's context specific, right?
It is.
We've talked about the compliment sandwich or the criticism sandwich. What they need,
Whichever way it is, yeah.
But the problem even with that thing is people can sometimes see what you're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, I've always tried to say, well, how can I put a positive spin on this? Like if we've got a situation where someone in a position of leadership is blocking people, the worst thing to do to start that conversation is go, you're blocking people. That's a problem, because what happens is people shut down and they stop listening to the rationale of anything you're talking about.
Yeah.
And so the way to try and approach those sorts of things, I guess, is to try and say, there's lots of people with some great skills and some great things who want to be able to express themselves more and show you what they can do. Will you be able to give them the opportunity? Would you be willing to give them the opportunity to do those things? But again, it's still context specific, and that's part of the reason why I did the talk on the communication stuff with the love languages, because the way that we perceive things is incredibly differently. Like for some people, admitting that I don't know something or that I was wrong, to them, they might see that as a massive weakness and lose respect. But actually, for me, there's nothing more powerful than admitting that I don't know something, because that sets an example as a leader that there are things that it's all right to not know or that I got wrong. And so the way that we carry ourselves through these things, we have to believe in the way that we're carrying ourselves. We can't go and be false versions of ourselves for the sake of trying to amend conflict. But we still have to try and get to opportunity, like you said in your situation, Sam, where you've got to get to know the people. You've got to try and understand what it is that makes them tick and how they see things. What is it? What aspects and attributes do they actually respect in people?
Yeah.
What do they see as weaknesses in people, and try and work out why that's the way that those things are, and to then try and make the world look in a way that they can appreciate. That's a skill that many of us in leadership don't have and need to work more on.
It's an ever evolving one, because every time you move into a new situation, the situation naturally is different. So you have to then work out how it fits with the current scenario, the current context, and how you bridge those gaps, how you ensure that you're not out on a limb because they don't like you, they don't trust you, etc., etc. And obviously, yes, you can't be liked and loved by everybody that you're working with, but it helps if you can get along and be respected, and the other way around as well, you respect the team.
Yeah. So trying to position it so that the person that you're in conflict with comes out so feeling like they win is often a good way of doing it. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to surrender or lose a thing. It's about finding kind of what's important, what motivates them to a degree. As you said, it's context to find that, and then giving them the opportunity to come out feeling like they won some small battle out of that situation to a degree.
I don't know if I entirely agree.
Conflict.
I only talk from my own context, but any scenario where I feel like I've let them win ends up coming back and biting me, because the persons that I've had the conflict with has been quite vocal about how they won the argument or whatever else afterwards. And I feel that sometimes it's better to try and suppress the conflict somehow and get it to a level where there is no need for a winner, but actually you've come to some kind of mutual agreement or level ground that settles.
I guess I didn't explain myself very well. You never want anything which is kind of a black and white, he won, she lost, that sort of situation, but you want to get the person coming out of it feeling like they achieved something, or they got something positive.
Okay, yeah.
The art of diplomacy.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yes, it's diplomacy more than anything else. This conversation, you come out of it, like you kind of got something, but I feel like I came out of it and got something, everyone's happy. It's not always possible, don't get me wrong. There's sometimes it's like, you can't do this unless you go through this process and I'm the gatekeeper, so you're not going to get through it. And you kind of have to find the compromise. You can't always do that. But if you can kind of find something so that no one loses face, I mean, no one, including yourself, that's the key thing there. You can't surrender your house and go, okay, you can have the house because you yelled at me for it. You kind of got to find a common ground that means you both don't walk away with your tail.
You've got to leave it in a situation where people are going to actually still be willing to speak up and speak their mind, because people that you work with, they need to know that their opinion is welcome, their opinion is needed, and they are part of a team, and collaboration is a part of those things. Like I had a recent situation where there was someone who was incredibly awkward in a meeting, and it was difficult, and I wanted to smash my head against the wall a few times to just try and deal with those things. The meeting finished, I went for a walk, I had to talk about it. Things were I felt a bit better in myself. They later contacted me where they sort of said they're a bit sorry, they're willing to give things a try, but they wanted to get their point across. And I said, thank you for talking to me. Please never feel like you can't challenge me. I want those opinions challenged. I want those ideas challenged. I want us to shape things together. That's the whole point of a collaborative team. If it's all me, it's probably going to fail. So I need those sorts of things. And the beauty of that is there's a bit of respect that's come out of that relationship as a result of two people having opinions that were very different on the way we should do stuff. But a conversation has happened where everyone is happy that they are able to talk about things. Maybe the arena in which they've done it wasn't the most ideal situation. We are in a position where there is more respect. And so moving forwards, hopefully the relationship is going to be more productive.
Yeah, I agree. It's finding those ways of moving forward, and like you say, moving out with everyone feeling more comfortable, more open, feeling like they can speak up is hugely important, especially in the modern work world where we're all remote. Feeling like you can't say anything and you're that silent person on a call that can't step up and speak up. I can't imagine how that would feel in the current world.
Just made me think of something. I don't know. It feels like an epiphany at this moment.
There is a light above your head right at this moment, so it works.
It's much brighter on yours, Simon.
Agile. It's taught me some of the things to deal with this in a way that I'd only just really realized and thought about, which is in the sort of conflict you described, this idea of experimenting, trialing things, getting feedback retrospective of them. The way I've often dealt with kind of the opinion sort of thing, I think we should do it this way, I think we should do it this way, is by using kind of an iteration or using an experiment. Well, why don't we try one way for 2 weeks, try another way for 2 weeks, feedback, see how they go, review, or 4 weeks or 8 weeks or whatever period of time. But by using kind of an iteration of just try something, feedback on it, see how it goes, allows you to try things, to experiment, to learn, to know that no one's right or wrong, everyone's going to get a fair shout, everyone gets to try it, and then no one's committed to it, which allows you to experiment, to learn, to fail, to it goes wrong and not lose face, it goes right to get credit, and then let others have their opinion as well, try things. And I think that kind of mindset of trialing things, the agile mindset in my head, helps deal with a lot of conflicts if you kind of refer back to it. I've done it a lot where I've gone, I think something different to you, but I'm never done this before either, so why don't we try what you say, see how it works. And it's, and then if it doesn't work, you actually, no one, as I said, loses that face to start with. And so people are much more willing to try many things. And you generally don't make everything a black and white answer. It's just an experiment. And it moves your teams to more of that kind of experimental mindset, reduces conflict in general, but not entirely. Trying to set a lot of things up. You can change a process, but you can say, well, why don't we change it like that now, get some feedback on it and see if it's any good, what the feedback says.
You need to be willing to take negative feedback as well.
Yeah, criticism.
Because if you're not willing to accept criticism, then there's like, what's the point?
Yeah, no, exactly. But you can set people up to say, well, let's get feedback, and you can help them frame it and look at it as feedback, and they'll be advocates of what they view, obviously. But that whole mindset, and if you start to get them to experiment with their work, others to experiment with their work, you create a culture in the team of that it's okay to try something and to back up on it. You're not committing to things, and it doesn't solve all conflicts. There's different types of conflicts. People yelling at each other because they just don't like the haircuts.
I have that all the time.
There's some conflicts that are deeper rooted, but there are some things that you can resolve with quite little tweaks to behaviors, and that is trying things, experimenting, that culture And we've talked about that in other podcasts, I think. That's a good way of dealing with some of the sort of cultural conflict that you might have with, well, my idea is better than yours, or I think we should do it this way. And you get that quite often in Scrum sprints. Why don't we try that? Next sprint, we'll try the other way.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is definitely a way of improving that culture. And I think the thing that I come back to is, and it's a very stereotypical phrase, but it's that everybody's intentions is good. No one usually goes into an argument, wanting to cause malice or cause hurt. They're just trying to prove their point because they believe they're right. And it's just trying to understand, they believe they're right for a reason. We need to understand what that belief comes from and how we can resolve it, and how can we come to some kind of level of compromise. By being kind and thinking about the positives, those can usually help the situation. I won't say always, because there are always scenarios that are outside of that, but that's always my first stance. Let's try and take the anger out of the situation. Let's try and be positive. Let's try and think about what the good intentions are here and try and work with that, and let the animosity drift away before we move on. But it doesn't always work. And I'm sure my wife will vouch for that in some of the arguments that we end up having occasionally. It doesn't happen every time.
It is funny how the sort of domestic discussions, arguments, etc., and the kind of work ones vary so differently. I don't know. I feel like a kind of personal life will have arguments constantly, whereas I think sometimes in my work life, I feel like they happen occasionally. And
I would agree with that.
I'm much more diplomatic at work than I am at home. Maybe I need to take a lesson from work, bring it back home. My girlfriend will be happy.
I completely agree with that. I think sometimes I feel my work gets the best of me, and home life is left with the rest, and that causes the upset sometimes.
Chris, you just the best you always.
You're just awesome, aren't you, Chris?
No, I think I'm just kind of, certainly work-life separation was something that was a lot easier to do.
Yeah.
When we're working in real offices with real people. There are things like, even if I've been frustrated at work, like my wife's going to see my frustrations, and sometimes my frustrations will carry on through a conversation that I have at home. And conversely, something that's going on in my personal life can affect the way that I work. Dealing with those things sort of honestly, and actually giving context to the right people about what's been going on, why I am the way that I am, as I understand it, is actually quite important as well. Like, arguments are going to happen, so let's just accept that's going to happen. Let's not try and avoid them, but let's try and be respectful, and let's try and communicate better. So probably we're kind of getting to the end of this, and we've talked a lot about feedback. Maybe, Simon, you've got some ideas for how people can give feedback to the testing peers.
Yeah, you can now contact us on several different channels. We've obviously got our email address, contact us at testingpeers.com. And we're on LinkedIn, just search for Testing Peers. We're on Twitter, at Testing Peers. And Chris has had the very fun task of setting up our Instagram page, which again, shockingly, is at Testing Peers. Get in touch if you have any feedback, if you have any stories of how you've dealt with conflict in the past, if you've got any ideas how conflicts could be resolved better, then please get in touch. But for now, thank you very much for listening, and we'll speak to you next time.
Goodbye.